Your student radio station on 12:51 a.m.
This is your role.
Keeping you up to date with the world of politics and current affairs, you're listening to Just a Word.
Just a Word aims at bringing you analysis and discussion on a selection of current affairs stories. Coming up in the next hour. Guests Barnaby Merrill, Callum Sinclair and Dan Welch join Jack Abbey to talk of the future of centrist politics and British defence policy.
My name is Sadiq Khan, I'm running to the Mayor of London and you're listening to Raw.
If you want to get in touch with Just a Word today, text 075 071 87777, email studio@radio.warwick.ac.uk, tweet us at Raw 12:51am, or click the contact tab on the web player if you're listening in live.
Don't forget to register to vote before May 22nd to have your say in the next general election.
It takes less than 5 minutes, so go to gov.uk/register to vote.
Good afternoon. In 1997, Tony Blair's new Labour won a landslide victory in the May general election on a centrist platform often known as the Third Way. This broadly was an attempt to reconcile the economic neoliberalism of Margaret Thatcher and John Major's Conservative Party with the social justice of Labour to create a new, massive coalition of voters who believed in a brighter future for Britain under Blair. It wasn't just popular in the UK, but over the pond in the United States as well. At the same time as Blair was being swept into Downing Street in Britain, Bill Clinton was beginning his second term as president under a similar centrist pretext. Consensus had been reached. Centrism would win election after election. History, Francis Fukuyama declared, was over. 20 years later, however, Theresa May seems to be taking the Tories back to its authoritarian roots after years of centrist one-nationism under David Cameron. Labour has revealed perhaps its most radically left-wing manifesto since its 1983 suicide note, and in America, Donald Trump has surged to power with the growth of the so-called alt-right on a platform of isolationism and far-right views. What happened to the centre, and where does it go from here? Well, one of its pioneers, the often reviled Tony Blair, recently gave us some idea of his feelings on the subject in an interview with his former spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, for GQ magazine.
Look, it's no great secret that I obviously think the Labour Party's gone in profoundly the wrong direction since I left in 2007.
And politics is a continuum. I did a piece for GQ a few weeks ago about Corbyn, and I'm in it. I said there is part of it that thinks, well, Tony begat Gordon, begat Ed, begat Jeremy. Do you think there's something in that? Do you think we sort of started this?
No, because I think we were always very clear about our own position.
But we paved the way for Gordon, who changed a bit. And then Ed came in, who changed a bit more. But
Gordon was in a supremely strong position to become the leader of the Labour Party. So, I think rather than go back over the personalities of it, there's a much, much bigger question, which is about the future of progressive politics.
Right.
And I think the progressive political position only wins when it builds out from the centre and when it has policies designed for the future.
That's being rejected.
And it has been rejected in the Labour Party, and we can see the result. We lost in 2010. We lost even bigger in 2015. And now we're 15 points adrift in the middle of a Tory government, losing safe Labour seats to the Tories. So, you know, the one thing I find really weird about the present situation is when people who are presently running things ascribe their defeats to those of us who won victories.
As we heard Alistair Campbell suggest there, has there been in the Labour Party sort of a gradual transition from towards the hard left that the Labour Party currently finds itself in? Has each leader since Tony Blair been more radical than the last, and is that sort of a transition, or is that just sort of coincidence? I'll start with Callum first of all.
I think if you listen to Alistair Campbell, you need to take everything he says with a pinch of salt and remember that he is spin nice to general, and that you can't inherently trust anything he says. But it's easy to construct a narrative where Labour decreases because it's gone towards the left, and that's not necessarily true. There's a range of other contexts and factors which affected it. But overall, I'd say, yeah, you could chart a gradual decline from sort of the centre to the left over the leaders.
Barnaby, is that a statement that you probably agree with? Has there been a transition towards Jeremy Corbyn, or is it just sort of a coincidence that each Labour leader has been more left-wing than the last?
I mean, I think it kind of, there's two different things here, where the first of which is kind of during the Labour government, where the kind of frustration with Tony Blair, kind of, especially towards the end of his tenure, he did increasingly focus on things like competition, market reforms, led to a general kind of feeling that Gordon Brown was more of an authentic Labour politician, and that's why he might have done better. I think then, after 2010, you have this classic thing of an opposition party going into its shell a little bit. So yeah, you saw it with the Tories in '97. They could have elected Ken Clarke, who was much more popular than the party in terms of polling. They went for William Hague instead, then for Ian Duncan Smith in 2001. This isn't unprecedented. So what you had Labour sort of do was then sort of say this kind of classic thing of sort of Labour activists is that they lost because they gave up their principles, and that what they need to do is kind of reconnect with those principles, which is what led to David Miliband, and then Jeremy Corbyn winning. This idea that kind of everyone else represented this kind of hideous compromise. But I think to an extent it's true, but I don't think you can kind of necessarily see the roots of everything to do with Jeremy Corbyn while Jeremy Corbyn is like to talk about Tony Blair. I think his success lies more around kind of the results of the last sort of 5 years as opposed to as far back as, say, 1997.
Sam Keeling, can we subscribe? I hate to use the term blame, but can we blame the current Labour position on Tony Blair? Does it go back that far?
I think, yeah, you probably can blame the current Labour position on Tony Blair, because it's not so much Tony Blair's policies that I think toxified sort of New Labour. I think it's sort of the actions of Tony Blair himself regarding the Iraq War. When people like John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn speak about New Labour, one of the things they bring up most is the Iraq War, and they say, you know, thank God we're not New Labour because of the Iraq War. It doesn't seem to me to be the policies of New Labour that are as much responsible for the presence of Jeremy Corbyn as the Iraq War. I think, you know, Corbyn and his fairly anti-war stance serve as the sort of ideal antidote to that kind of neoconservative strain that Tony Blair sort of caused to be linked with centrist policies.
Dan, do you agree? Do you think that Tony Blair himself, not his centrist policies, were the reason that Labour now finds itself in a position where it's more left-wing than it has been for a number of years?
I think you kind of need to separate the foreign policy of Labour from the domestic policy, because obviously Ed Miliband was slightly more to the left domestically, but I wouldn't say he was outside of the... He was obviously to the left of Blair in foreign policy, but I think Blair was an unusual Labour leader in terms of foreign policy. I do think that there has been a reaction in the Labour Party to Blair's foreign policy, and I think generally to the idea that centrist foreign policy has failed, which I think that it mostly has, when you consider that in the last 15 years, Britain has been involved in wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now in Yemen, and basically all of them have been terrible disasters. So I think that there has been, obviously since Iraq, a big anti-war vote on the left. I think that Corbyn is the expression of that. And I think domestically, a lot of this is also a reaction to austerity, in that British economics has shifted quite far to the right since 2010. And with the impact, obviously, of the financial crisis, a lot of people believe that centrist economics has failed and that a shift to the left is needed.
Before we move on to the future of the Labour Party that we'll come on to in a few minutes' time, in the same interview with Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell suggests that just 2 years ago, David Cameron won an election on a centrist platform. And I'm just wondering how true it is that just 2 years ago, given the position of the Tories now supporting what's called a hard Brexit, is it true that 2 years ago the Tories were a centrist party? Callum, first of all.
I think it's a reductionist to just label things left, right, and centre. I mean, that's not a new argument. But, to just see what the Tories define as centre and what Labour would define as centre are two radically different things, especially in sort of ideology and commitment. Yeah. But I think the Tories ultimately, and David Cameron, did strive for centrism, but as much as one leader can strive, as much as Jeremy Corbyn can strive for a hard left party, he can't change the makeup and the format of the party. And like Labour, a lot of them remain quite, determinedly right.
Sam, was One Nation conservatism, is that a centrist position, or is it still a right-wing position in your mind?
I think it's been made to be more of a centrist position these days because of what it sort of entails. David Cameron was in favour of, modernisation, and I don't know whether the sort of the modernisation of the Tory party has any genuine links with sort of One Nation conservatism, but things like gay rights, for example, which the Conservative Party pushed through during the Cameron years, I think could be seen as being more centrist. I mean, I sort of agree with Callum in a sense, because it is a bit too straightforward to sort of label things as left, right, and centre. However, I would definitely argue that the Conservative Party under David Cameron was not really conservative in any meaningful sense, with a small c.
Barnaby, would you like to add to that? Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, in my experience, have found the expression One Nation conservatism a bit of a sham, especially when the idea that when it's seen as being this kind of moderate thing. I mean, while David Cameron might have pushed through, along with Nick Clegg, same-sex marriage, they had one of the most fiscally conservative platforms, arguably in history. They wanted to reduce the size of state and GDP to below 25%. They were promising to legislate so budget deficits were illegal. And we're continuing to cut down things to reduce the deficit by the end of the Parliament, which has now been dropped. I think in many ways what kind of Theresa May bodies represents One Nation conservatism more, in which it's a large state acting for conservative goals, whereas really Cameron's our post-financial crisis, the Conservative Cameron Osborne kind of manifesto was mainly centred around kind of almost libertarian levels of low government spending, though still with classic kind of conservative intrusion into private lives, things like that. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't say it was a centrist platform by any stretch of the imagination. There hasn't really been a centrist conservative manifesto since maybe 1974.
With sort of, obviously, if 2 years ago the Tory party wasn't operating on a centrist platform, now it's operating on really quite a right-wing, socially conservative platform that wants to leave the European Union and opt for a so-called hard Brexit. If that's true, why is a sort of not far right, but quite severely right-wing Tory government gaining so much support while a really quite left-wing Jeremy Corbyn isn't? Is it the case that the British public are more receptive to right-wing politicians, people like Nigel Farage, than they are to people like Jeremy Corbyn on the left? I'll come to Callum first of all on that.
I think it's demonstrative of a larger change within the country, where it's not so much that these parties are dictating the terms of the conversation, it's that they're being reactionary. And if Cameron's government shows anything, it's the Conservatives are more than happy to sell out beliefs and morals for electability. And by going to that centrist position, Theresa May is just demonstrating that was never an ideological position, because she herself campaigned for Brexit and now she's gone to a hard right position. So it just demonstrates that the Tories really have absolutely no values.
Dan, do you agree with that? And do you think that the British public are more receptive to right-wing leaders than they are left-wing ones?
I think that they are in general. I think it's overstated quite a bit. I think that if you look at like the polling on Corbyn's like economic policy, they tend to be quite popular. Stuff like, polling has consistently shown that people don't like austerity. They think it's gone too far. I think that although Theresa May is quite right-wing socially, although I wouldn't say that she's necessarily as right-wing, she's obviously clearly to the left of Paul Nuttall, for example. She is not that right-wing economically, at least in her rhetoric. A lot of if you actually look at a lot of her policies, they are not very different from what the Conservatives were doing before, but they are basically dressed up in a kind of way to make it seem like, like the talk today about workers' rights, which if you actually look at it, is like their idea for carers, where carers now have the option to take a year off completely unpaid to care for people, which is not especially useful for carers, but gets lots of great headlines about how caring the Conservatives are about people who need to care for people. So I think that she has moved to the centre rhetorically. She has been very quiet about, for example, the cuts to welfare. That has not been brought up particularly much at all. So I'd say that really Theresa May is actually being perceived by the public as like quite a centrist leader economically, and that has allowed her to take in quite a few centrist voters that Labour has perhaps moved too far to the left for, or at least they believe that it has in terms of Corbyn's rhetoric.
Yeah. Now we've looked at how British politics has arrived sort of in this moment. Let's just take a look at where the opposition as Labour look like they probably will be on the 9th of June, where they go next. Again, Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell addressed this issue, so I thought it would be interesting to hear from a former Labour leader who did win 3 elections and the last Labour leader to win an election, how he thinks Labour can get back to a position where it could actually form a government.
When was the last time you spoke to Corbyn?
I don't know. That's some time ago, I guess.
Has he ever phoned you up and said, Tony, you just used to do this job, got any tips?
No, but, why should he?
Well, because you've done the job.
Yeah, but, we obviously disagree strongly about the direction of the Labour Party.
Do you think there's any chance ever that Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
I think we've got to pass on that one.
So that's a no?
No, it's not a no. It's, how do I answer this without just getting into a whole heap of Blair attacks Corbyn? I mean, but all I can say to people in the Labour Party is, if you want to get back into a position of being a competitive opposition with a chance of winning power, you've got to go back to the centre, definitively and clearly, and you've got to have policies that address the future. And this is it's
so
like...
you're not arguing for a return to New Labour?
New Labour, you've got to demystify New Labour. All New Labour was...
Do you not think the centre is being rejected?
No, I don't think the centre is rejected by the people.
Right.
I mean, I think, look, in 2015, Cameron won from essentially a centre-right position. If you look...
So when you say, you keep saying this thing about, right, if we go into the next election with a hard Brexit Tory, I think actually quite hard, out-UKIPing UKIP, Tory leader, and a hard left leader, you've got millions of people who are politically homeless. Surely the logical conclusion of that is that what's happening, the churn in politics at the moment, can only be broken now by some sort of new political force emerging. Or is that too difficult because of our system?
I think it's extremely difficult. Or the old political forces reasserting their...
But that's just not happening inside the Labour Party at the moment.
No, it's not. But
and people like you and me are sort of opting out of that and devoting our energies to Brexit because we feel at least that's maybe got a chance, even though
it's also because it's the most urgent thing facing the country. And one of the things what the Labour Party's got to understand about the present situation is that when you've got something as critical as Brexit happening, the country and millions of people out there are expecting us to lead.
So could there be a place for the Lib Dems, I know, have got a very clear position. The SNP have got a clear position. Could there be a case for a new pro-European party that fights the next election just on that, the next election, not the one after, the next election?
No, I think it's incredibly difficult to start something new
but then we're
in British politics.
Then we're doomed.
Firstly, then, the obvious question to ask following that is whether Blair and Campbell are right when they suggest that we won't see Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister anytime soon. Even Labour Deputy Leader Tom Watson recently admitted in an interview with The Guardian that the Tories could be about to win a landslide election in the style of Margaret Thatcher. Before we talk in the studio about this issue, I went out into SUHQ today to get some opinions on this issue in the building. Here are those opinions, and we'll talk about them afterwards, and we'll talk about what people in the studio think.
If Theresa May unveils some catastrophic policy, yes.
No. Only if he was running for the seat of Twitter North.
No, I don't believe Jeremy Corbyn will win an election. I don't believe that will support the party or the country.
I don't think Jeremy Corbyn's got a chance of winning this election.
I don't know, but I don't think so, actually.
No.
Not humanely or physically possible.
Possibly.
Well, what? You didn't say it.
Yeah, but I'm the only person that said possibly, so I need a
I don't know, maybe there could be a coalition of chaos or something.
I don't know if it's just the sample of people I selected, but only one person there said that it was even possible that Jeremy Corbyn could be Prime Minister come the 8th of or the 9th of June. Why do we think so many people, and it might have just been the cross-section of people that I chose to talk to, but why do so many people think that Jeremy Corbyn can't be leader of the Labour Party? And do you agree? Sam, first of all. Not leader of the Labour Party, Prime Minister.
Well, the problem with Jeremy Corbyn is I think his heart's in the right place, but I think British people just aren't really that interested in socialism. And, you know, with all the events that have been going on in the Labour Party over Jeremy Corbyn's time as leader, I mean, it seems to a lot of people quite reasonably that he can't even lead a party successfully, so God knows how he'll be able to lead a country. I mean, I know I'm probably spinning off the kind of stuff that Jeremy Corbyn himself would say is sort of attributable to the right-wing media, but he just doesn't look like a credible leader. I don't think his policies are what people really want. And something that you asked about earlier regarding sort of the popularity of sort of Theresa May's supposedly quite right-wing party, I think the reason why the right-wing party under Theresa May is doing better than Corbyn's left-wing party is because people, I think in Britain especially, are generally more conservative than they are left-wing. And even though the current Conservative Party might be a bit more right-wing than a lot of people would be comfortable with, it's a lot more palatable than Jeremy Corbyn's sort of hard left, nationalise everything, you know, nuclear disarmament, all-around kind of package.
Barnaby, do you agree with that? Do you think that there is absolutely any chance at all that Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister on the 9th of June? And if not, what do you think it is that about him or about his policies that put people off voting for a hard left Labour Party?
I think a large part of it is arguably more just the perception of Jeremy Corbyn, which he does nothing to help. I think the point of his problem is that he lost, you know, whenever the next election was going to be, around the time of the vote on the Syria airstrikes, in which it came out that, you know, he appeared to be a crank pacifist, you know, vindictively sacking people who voted against him despite it being a free vote. Ultimately, I think the problem is, as sort of what Sam said, that he doesn't seem like a credible leader. I think individually his policies poll well. The problem being that when they're all parceled together under the caption of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, all people hear is Jeremy Corbyn and it turns them right off. I think there's an argument that, you know, people in low-income situations, struggling, you know, the jams, as Theresa May calls them, wouldn't be receptive to these left-wing policies, because they are. It shows in opinion polling.
Yeah.
The problem is the way they're perceived. A, is the fact that because it's Jeremy Corbyn, they don't think that he'd be competent enough to actually enact them. B, they don't think he's ever going to be in a position to enact them in the first place. I think it's the main problem. It's that ultimately he's lost the messaging battle. And unlike Ed Miliband, he didn't even try.
Yeah. Callum, I've talked to you quite a lot about Jeremy Corbyn in the past, and you were in that video saying that no, you don't think that he has the backing of the party or the country. What is it? Is it personality or is it policy for you that means that you can't vote for Jeremy Corbyn, or you wouldn't want to vote for Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I'd just disagree with what Sam said earlier about socialism being sort of irrelevant in England or in the UK. I think it's more indicative of like a wider crisis of socialism that's going on, and like the left has survived worse splits than this in like the 20s, and with the Sino-Soviet split. You know, I don't think it's completely irreparable. It's not the end of the left like some people are saying, but I think the way it's working, the way it's packaged, and the context of like some of these sort of, you know, more right-leaning topics like the EU mean that Corbyn isn't effectively communicating this message. And I don't think socialism is dead in this country. I think there's still a thriving socialist heritage within the working and middle classes within this country. So it's not the end for the left or for Labour, but I've heard other people say, and I agree with it, I like what Corbyn's saying, just wish it wasn't Corbyn.
Sam, do you have a response to that at all? Do you think that there is a culture of socialism in the working and middle classes?
Well, to begin with, to address something that I didn't say that socialism was irrelevant. I just said that I don't think British people at the moment really want it as much as they want other things. But yeah, I don't know really. I think even the left wing in Britain isn't as radical as the left in other countries, in other parts of Europe. I think, there always has been, ever since the early 20th century, a sort of reasonably strong culture of socialism in this country. I just don't think it's really ever been very big. There are a cluster of people who are in favour of socialist policies. Jeremy Corbyn's doing quite well in terms of Labour Party membership, but what the problem is making socialism appeal to people who aren't political junkies. There are plenty of people who are really dead into politics who are in favour of socialism, plenty of them at Warwick University, for example. But in the population at large, I don't think socialism has the kind of appeal that it does to a lot of young people.
Dan Welsh. Oh, Barnaby, did you want to? No, Dan. So, obviously, what Sam's suggesting then is that for a large number of people, socialism is not really something that they feel connected to. That sort of suggests what a lot of people say, which is that most of this country is largely politically moderate. Does that mean that in this election, during which Alistair Campbell says the Tories are out UKIPing UKIP and Jeremy Corbyn is obviously hard to the left, does that mean that there are millions of politically homeless people in this country at the moment who don't really have a major party that they can get behind?
I think sort of. There's obviously been quite a lot of voters who have moved from UKIP to the Conservatives over the last year or so. If you look further back, the last 5 years have seen the collapse of the Lib Dems, the rise of UKIP, the rise and fall of Labour in the opinion polls. So there's been quite a lot of movement around. It's not as if we have a situation where in America where 45% of the population is die-hard Democrats and 45% is Republicans. And then, realistically, you have 3 or 4% of the population who moves. I think we have a lot larger than that. But what was your question again?
Is there a large proportion of this country that is politically homeless at the moment?
I wouldn't say homeless. I think that Theresa May has benefited from. I think that picking this time to do the election has been very, very good for her. I saw an YouGov poll today which showed that basically how Theresa May has got to about 48% or so in the polls is basically by winning all of the Leave voters, plus about 25% of plus about half or so actually of the Remain voters, which are about 25% of the electorate. And that's basically got her to where she is. But I don't think that's necessarily sustainable in the long run. I think that if you looked at the opinion polls of big broad issues of Remain and Leave voters, there was a very, very large gap between them on issues like immigration, on issues like culture, on economics as well. I think that those issues will come back in the future, probably I would say within the next few years as soon as the negotiations begin. So I think that Theresa May has been able to put together a unnaturally large coalition, but I expect that by 2022 the Conservatives will be on a much lower percentage of the vote, and probably, depending on how Labour does, they may have gone back to Labour, they may have gone back to third or fourth parties, who knows. But yeah, I think that Theresa May's new Conservative Party isn't necessarily going to last.
Barnaby, Blair and Campbell in that interview suggested that the only way for Labour to win again in the future is that instead of building from the left, it needs to build again from the centre and potentially move out to the left, but build from the centre. Do you think that is the way to win an election in this country as a left-wing party?
I think it's unavoidable. So if you look at one of the most recent YouGov polls, actually, surprisingly, one thing I would say I take issue with is about political homelessness, because 78% of people are now going to be voting for one of the main two parties. That's an increase of 11% from the last election only 2 years ago. So this is actually sort of partisan de-alignment. This is partisan realignment, effectively. Ultimately, Labour will have to win over voters who are voting Tory this election. Many voters. I think a lot of people who support Jeremy Corbyn very heavily don't want to do that because they see these people as sort of morally wrong in some ways. Well, not even traitors. They see them as unkind, uncaring people who want poor people to die. And ultimately, as Sam's saying, most people don't think about politics that often. this election is being won on 5-second clips on BBC News.
They say the word strong and stable.
Yeah. Ultimately, people know the big issue is Brexit. Theresa May appears to have a strong position on it. Whatever you think, they're going to vote for her. And Labour do have to win back some of these voters. Whether that necessarily means moving hard to the centre in terms of all of their policies, not so much. I think the important thing is that Labour just need to actually be addressing their response to the key issues in a clear fashion, which they're not doing and haven't done arguably since 2010. So I think it's not necessarily moving to the centre, but it's appealing to those kind of voters who don't really think about politics apart from when they watch the 6 o'clock news for 5 minutes while they're making their tea.
Callum, do you agree with that? Do you think that there is sort of an element of the Tory vote that Labour needs to win back? And how do you think they do that? And do you think that in order for Labour to win in the future, Scotland is going to be important, winning back Scotland from the SNP?
Well, just mathematically, you need to win back some of the Tory votes. There's no way he's going to be able to do it without it. Which, like we've been talking about, Tory votes is a very large, a very broad demographic at this point. It involves a lot of people, ranging from former Labour, Labour for Life supporters and UKIPers. So I think it's important in that sense that, we need to look at how Labour moves on from this, because ultimately they'll probably lose if the polling's right. So it's not whether Labour can move to the centre, it's how they're going to move on. And obviously Scotland plays a big part in that. They possibly could get decimated because that's where a socialist stronghold of the United Kingdom really lies. But I think ultimately, going on from Jeremy Corbyn, Labour needs to find a way to recentre itself. But how does it do that? Because it's taken on, hundreds of thousands of new members, all of them relative Corbynites. You can't just adjust a party line when over half the party is vastly, left. There's no real logistical way that there's the apparatus for the centre to come back into Labour, directly following. Possibly they lost a lot, but there's no real way to know.
Sam, do you agree with that?
I agree with Callum about his point in which he said that mathematically Labour will actually have to, appeal to all sorts of people who perhaps used to support them but now have gone, to UKIP and then to the Tories, or just straight from Labour to the Tories. If you look at all the people, or most of the people who have sort of gone to the Conservatives from other parties, the people who went from being sort of apathetic or old Labour voters who then went to UKIP and then went to the Conservatives from UKIP, or just the people who are going straight from Labour to the Conservatives. The one thing that I think they've all got in common is they're all quite socially conservative. Theresa May a couple of days ago blamed Jeremy Corbyn for sort of abandoning patriotic working class people. And I think this is possibly the problem that Labour have got at the moment. They're not appealing to people who are sort of potentially economically left-wing, but socially conservative, because what Labour offers is a brand of sort of economic leftism and social sort of liberalism with large state sort of social intervention. And I think if Labour want to sort of regain voters, beyond the standard idealistic young people and the sort of the cluster of wealthy middle class left wingers, they're going to have to do something about their social policy to appeal to the old fashioned patriotic socially conservative working class sort of old Labour voters who sort of held them in office throughout the sort of certain periods in the 20th century, the kind of people who voted for Harold Wilson, people of that sort of stripe, the old fashioned kind of Brexit supporting old Labour cluster.
Just quickly then, before we move on to some things that might offer some optimism for the centre. Barnaby, Alistair Campbell suggested there that perhaps the way forward for the centre for perhaps the next election is to create some sort of pro-European party and fight the election as that party, and then potentially go back to old party lines after the election. But in some way, the progressives that are in favour of the European Union, people from the left of the Tory party, from the centre of Labour and the Lib Dems, that's and such, should form together and form a pro-EU party and fight the election on that grounds. Is that a good idea?
No. Any talk, particularly in this election, of a kind of progressive alliance or any kind of new party is politically illiterate when
it's too late, isn't it?
Well, that, and when you factor in the existence of first past the post. We're getting to a point now where the Conservative vote is higher than all the other parties put together and is verging on literally 50% of the popular vote, which would be the first time someone's done that since 1931. Yeah. So there was a YouGov poll of that very exact thing. So it said, what if Labour moderates and other moderates split and formed a Progressives party, which is the current talk. Yeah. So you had the Tories losing like 2% of their vote.
Yeah.
And then you essentially had the Progressives on 19, Labour on 17, and then that was basically it. And those other around, Labour was still ahead. So ultimately, all you're really doing is fragmenting the opposition to the Conservative Party. Even if this party magically absorbed everyone sort of moderate in Labour, enough kind of middle class, like sort of moderate Conservatives, and all of the Lib Dems, it would probably achieve a similar kind of poll rating to like Jeremy Corbyn right now. And a lot of Labour voters' second choice isn't the Lib Dems or the Green Party. If they were forced to, they probably might well vote Conservative because of their kind of views on social issues or things like that. It's just a bit of a pipe dream that is only really kind of a factor for people who watch too much American TV, and they think the Democratic Party is this perfect, wonderful bastion of centrism, despite the fact that they lose winnable elections. But that's just me.
I'll come back to Barnaby in just a second as our seemingly resident French election expert. But the French election does seem to offer some sort of optimism for centrists, potentially, because Emmanuel Macron, the new, young, charismatic president of France, sort of identifies himself as being above the sort of left-right dichotomy, and he won the French presidential election on that platform just over a week ago. He won in the second round of voting, where it was just him and Marine Le Pen. He won 65.1% of the vote, compared to 66.1 in the end, compared to Marine Le Pen's 33.9% of the vote. Does that offer hope for the centre in this country? And if so, what lessons can the centre learn from it?
Again, I don't think you can adequately kind of translate something that happens in France, something that happens in Britain, the same way it works in America. You know, people were saying the same thing about Barack Obama. Macron has done very well, partially because of the French instinctive fear of the Front National, because it evolved out of the old Pétainiste group, who are literally Nazi collaborators, and that's a big problem anyway. I think he succeeded primarily because France's economy is less kind of liberalised than European economies generally anyway. Something like 45% of their GDP goes to the state. In a way, France could almost do with the kind of neoliberal revolution that they never really had. Though again, the same problems might well emerge. And I think, so Macron had one advantage, which was the economic system in France, another advantage was the electoral system in France. And just a kind of general commitment to sort of like cultural liberalism. But I do think if his economic reforms, which are generally lean towards the right, don't come off very well, he'll be in exactly the same position as the mainstream in the UK and other parts of Europe. So we discredited and seen as not being for working people, who did actually in quite large numbers support Marine Le Pen. Not nearly enough for a majority, of course, because otherwise she would have won. But there's certainly the kind of industrial, the kind of French Rust Belt almost does generally lean towards that way anyway. So he does need to be very careful. It's encouraging, but I don't think it's a case study for other countries to emulate, because France is quite a unique situation.
Sam, just quickly before we move on, what do you make of the French election?
I sort of agree with the sentiment of what Barnaby was saying, although I would argue that Emmanuel Macron may not have won so much because he was Emmanuel Macron as the fact that he wasn't Marine Le Pen, if you see what I mean. So people all across the spectrum, even those on the centre-right, endorsed Macron as opposed to Le Pen, for example, Fillon.
It is worth saying that he did outperform polls for Francois Fillon and the far left candidate Mélenchon by about 9% compared to how they would have against Le Pen, based on general matchup. So there was obviously some level of appeal. I mean, I had to give him some credit.
Although, do you think that the fact that sort of Le Pen was the alternative may have compelled some people who may not otherwise have voted?
I certainly agree. But I do also think that if someone else was in place, I think, for example, if Fillon had been the candidate, a lot more moderate leftists wouldn't have voted for him, because Fillon's platform was even more to the right.
Do you think they would have spoilt their vote then?
I don't think you would have seen people voting for Le Pen so much, though you would have seen a few. I just think that, Macron did have at least the advantage of, because of his centrist profile, he could attract people from large, because the French Socialist Party, while economically it's quite left-wing, its last government was fairly authoritarian socially. The French right kind of varies from kind of Ken Clarke types to people who would be like in UKIP in the UK. So there's quite a broad spectrum of people who are willing to go towards the centre. But I don't think that necessarily exists in the UK. Sorry, I interrupted Sam there horribly.
That's okay. We're going to have to move on, I'm afraid. Before we come on to British defence policy, talking about Trident, the renewal of Trident, but also moving away from Trident to talk about the spending on 2 new aircraft carriers and cuts to the Marines and to the reserve forces in the UK. We're going to go to a quick song. This is Sagreed with Dynamite.
Welcome to your student radio station, bringing you great shows.
Welcome, this is a Vibes at 5. You are tuned into On Broadway.
Welcome to Would I Lie to You? This is going to be great.
Oh my god, this is...
Great music.
Vocals are so good.
You'll be in love like all of us.
Right into the
Hi, we're Blossoms and you're listening to Raw.
So we are here with Greg James.
My name is Eddie Izzard.
Keep up to date with the arts.
We're going to be discussing a few trailers.
Seeing a film like Moonlight, which I felt was much more, I think, maybe progressive.
News and politics.
Presenting you with live coverage of the US election.
People make that decision. That's the entire point of a democracy.
Sports.
Raw Sport, Fancy League.
2-0 to Wimbledon. Jake feeling.
On-campus coverage.
That's where the band's final.
One of the most professionally polished sets.
Welcome to the big decision. Varsity, the spirit and the drive and the determination. Warwick University have won.
Online and on 12:51 AM. This is Raw.
Can there ever be a united kingdom in post-Brexit Britain?
My Country, a national theatre drama, seeks to bring the voices of Britain's regions together to answer this question.
Running from Thursday the 25th of May until Saturday the 27th.
Book for the 25th of May for a post-show talk from director Rufus Norris.
With tickets available at just £6.50 for students.
Book now at warwickartcentre.co.uk.
In a world where students had to save tirelessly to see good movies, there was just one award-winning society who could save the day.
Warwick Student Cinema is here to help.
Showing blockbusters, classics, and independent films at outstanding value. And if you volunteer, you can see all of these for free, as well as having the opportunity to work in front of house or learn the art of projection. To find out more, go to filmsoc.warwick.ac.uk.
Welcome back to Just a Word here on Raw 12:51 AM. Moving on now from the general election, but remaining broadly within politics. The second half of today's show will focus on the issue of defence and military spending. Second half, I wrote this when I was assuming we'd finished that last section at past. A few weeks ago, the Times reported what they described as a spending crisis in the British Armed Forces, with any spending that was taking place going into the wrong areas. Just a Word is going to examine whether this claim is true and look at the preparedness of British Armed Forces. I'll be talking to my guests in just a moment's time to ask them for their thoughts on defence. But first of all, here's some of the sort of reading that I did earlier, and I've sort of produced a little report on it. Military expenditure remains one of the largest areas of the government's budget. But other than the debate around Trident, in recent election cycles, it hasn't received quite so much coverage as other areas. For the sake of doing things slightly differently, our coverage will take the focus away from Trident. Instead, we will look at the spending on new aircraft carriers, cuts to the commandos, and the preparedness of the military and those militaries of our European allies to face a hostile threat in Eastern Europe. In 2007, the Labour government announced the development of a new class of aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth class. Those remain under construction, but are now confirmed to be named HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales. The original cost of the aircraft carriers was meant to be £3.5 billion, but by 2010 this had risen to over £6 billion. They remain a major contributor to the military's supposed £10 billion budget hole, yet the government remained committed to them, and they are now so far completed that they cannot be cancelled. But have they been worth the money? Well, they will be the largest warships the Royal Navy has ever built, with a 4-acre flight deck that can carry 40 aircraft and on which you could, were you inclined to do so, park over 400 London buses. The problem, however, is that none of the planes currently in the Royal Navy's fleet can fly from their decks. The government has yet to set out its plan to fund the 138 new Lockheed F-35 jump jets it intends to purchase, which would contribute even more to the black hole in funding. A 3-star general, however, who wished to remain anonymous, told The Times that the ships would be vulnerable to new advanced missile systems built by both China and Russia, as well as the diesel-electric submarines built by Moscow, which are claimed to be the quietest ever built. What's more, reports and rumours are rife that the military is short on parts and spares in all areas, leaving it to follow a make, do and mend strategy. This is as it attempts to take some of the hit to help fund the new class of nuclear submarines set to replace the Trident programme, which will cost £47 billion over the next 2 decades. More military cuts are taking place in the Royal Navy, as the elite force of Marines known as the Commandos are seeing their numbers cut quite significantly. After cutting 500 Marines in 2010, the government now intends to cut another 200 from the 6,700 strong force, which could see the force lose its viability as a power in sustained land campaigns for which it is vital. World War II, the Falklands and Korea were all won through amphibious campaigns. Such a victory in the future might be rather less possible. This does suggest then that perhaps Britain's current course of its military spending is not a course that it can sustainably take going into the future. In the final sort of 5 minutes here then, we'll talk through what the British military can actually do in terms of its defences, where it should focus its spending. First of all, we'll talk about Trident, and we'll cover it quickly. Is it worth the money that it's going to cost, £40-odd billion over the next couple of decades? And is it worth the money, and should Britain have a nuclear deterrent at all, or like Jeremy Corbyn thinks, should we unilaterally disarm? Callum, first of all.
I find one of these topics that I'm really torn on, because ideologically I do agree with nuclear disarmament, because I can't see a productive argument for having nuclear weapons, but there's a little part of me that rejects it and thinks that as a deterrent it works in the sense that if you have it, other people won't use it. But the unpredictability and the sheer improbability of a nuclear war makes think that 40 billion just becomes unnecessary at a point.
Sam, do you think that a nuclear deterrent is a vital thing for the UK to have? And if so, is it worth £40 billion?
It's undoubtedly a worthwhile thing to have. And I think 40 billion is a reasonable price to pay if it sort of increases or decreases the chance of us all getting killed by or threatened by a foreign power. I sort of agree with Callum to a sense. I think nuclear disarmament would be a lovely thing if it were possible, but it isn't. I mean, unfortunately, we don't control the rest of the world. We can't decide what they do. And in an unpredictable and unstable world in which people are always building new missiles and developing new weapons, we need to make sure that we're keeping up with them so that we've got a sort of an effective and up-to-date deterrent.
Dan Welsh, do you think that it's important for the UK to have a nuclear deterrent, or is Trident really not worth that kind of money?
I think that Trident is worth the money and that it is kind of the ultimate insurance policy. It is basically a defence against any kind of invasion over the next, however long it's going to last, decades really. However, I would say that I have the unusual position that we should spend money on Trident, but also dramatically reduce defence spending in general. Given that I think Trident is, as I said, an insurance policy, I don't think that we have a need for such a large army or armed forces. I think Britain is trying to keep up with the other countries on the UN Security Council and failing miserably, and should not even actually try.
Sam, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I sort of. In response to that, it is worth remembering that the defence spending also goes towards the intelligence services, and the intelligence services, I think, are probably the most important part of the armed force and the sort of the defence forces in this country, because the number of things that the intelligence agencies have sort of prevented over the last couple of years, I think, has been phenomenal. Britain happily hasn't been affected by too many terrorist attacks over the last couple of years, apart from obviously the one in Westminster earlier this year. And I think I would agree that we should sort of increase. I think we should increase defence spending. However, I also think that we should decrease defence activity. So I would, for example, pull soldiers out of various overseas territories, whilst also increasing spending so that soldiers are looked after.
Dan?
Yeah, I would say that I wouldn't class intelligence spending as like something that I would wish to cut. It would be stuff like the new aircraft carrier.
Well, this is something I wanted to come on
the
to discuss.
80,000 or so standing soldiers that we have.
Do you think that these two aircraft carriers, because they have been described by a general who I said in the report wishes to remain anonymous, as vulnerable to the new missile systems being developed by Russia and China, as well as to the new Russian submarines, are those kind of aircraft carriers worth the money? Does Britain need to have a world-class navy anymore? Once, obviously, it ruled the waves, but now is there any point in having that? Because we're never going to be able to compete with the navies of China, Russia, and the United States. Callum?
What it comes down to is, like, with Trident, what nuclear threat are we in the foreseeable future actively fielding from Britain? North Korea can't produce a missile, even with an intercontinental ballistic missile, couldn't reach mainland UK. Iran doesn't really have beef with us. I don't think they'd be the first on the list of nuclear attacks. It's difficult to imagine a situation where these sort of effects are actually recognised. But I think with the aircraft carriers, I'm not sure whether I don't know the practicality of it. I don't know the ins and outs of the missile system and how it works. But in a time of austerity, in a time of recession, in a time of where we're trying to reduce our military presence, we shouldn't be advocating this extensive militarism. We should be advocating more globalism, which is something I do praise Jeremy Corbyn for in his foreign policy.
Dan, what do you think of the idea then that Britain's, you say our defence spending should go down. What do you think of our cyber defence spending? Because obviously the NHS just a few days ago was hit by a ransomware attack that has gone on to affect 200,000 people. Is that the kind of thing that we should be putting our money into? Because cyber warfare seems to be the way that much sort of international sort of relations seems to be going. If you have a problem with a country, you don't go to war with them, you go to cyber war almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we should. Well, I mean, there is cyber defence, and then there is also, the NHS using Windows XP 8 years after they stopped updating Windows XP, which I wouldn't necessarily class as defence spending. I think that. It's clear that IT policy in Britain is pretty terrible in public services. I do think that there should be spending on cyber defence policy. I think that is obviously a threat that's not necessarily covered by nuclear weapons, unlike conventional warfare. So I would agree with that, and also agree with just upgrading the general IT infrastructure of the public services.
Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for from Just a Word this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with a general election focus, plenty of student reaction to national events, and we'll take a look at what to expect on the 8th of June. Keep up to date with student and national news by following @Raw News Warwick, or check out jackabbey.justaword.wordpress.com for articles and podcasts from Just a Word.